Hi, guys. So libraries and community systems is this big IMLS-funded national 3-year research project into the definition and value of tribal and public libraries to the social well-being outcomes within their local socio-ecological systems. We're going to cover a lot of definitions, so don't worry about that quite yet. Today, I'll be focusing specifically on what we found out about valuing libraries and what we can't know given current library research. So we ask a few questions. How do we define tribal and public libraries within local contexts? Within that context, what is the function of a library? And then what is the measurable value of a library to a local socio-ecological system? In order to so there are a lot of definitions for all of these words. I'm going to share with you the assumption building definitions that we ourselves at within the project are using as the foundation of our assumptions. So tribal is the word tribal here is a US government designation that doesn't reflect the organization of any specific sovereign indigenous nation or its people. Okay, so it's just a government term. Tribal and public libraries. So these are government terms related to specific kinds of governance of libraries in the US. It's a form of recognition. Not all libraries serving their communities are recognized by the Institute of Museum and Library Services because they, for whatever local reason they have, don't file an annual report with their state library agency. And so those aren't included in our study. We're only including libraries and places that have a recognized library. Here, when I talk about local community, we mean the commonly understood service boundary of a single library building. So in some cases, this is as large as multiple counties, and sometimes it's as small as like 10 city square blocks. When I say socio-ecological system, these are systems of complex and sometimes simple interdependency between social and environmental nodes, networks, and institutions. And here, when I say institutions, I'm meaning like social structures, like formal and informal rules or government. You can think of this term as a way of recognizing that resources that people have access to in many ways are dependent on the living and built environments where they are. And they're relative to social standing, which in turn is strongly influenced in the United States by demographic and educational characteristics. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this last definition, social well-being. It refers to interrelated social, so this human group specific dimension that may afford individuals in that group a life of full capability. So having the potential to achieve their outcomes of choice. This project is a direct descendant of the work of Michael Norton, Mark Stern, and Elizabeth DeYoung for IMLS to link libraries and social well-being outcomes. Most recently in the work, Understanding the Social Wellbeing Impacts of the Nation's Libraries and Museums. That came out last year. Well, actually, more than a year ago now. So it was 2021. Whoa. In this project, we use social well-being and community well-being interchangeably. So if I'm talking about community well-being, I'm in my mind, what I'm referring to is this sort of interrelated mix of dimensions. So let's look at what that looks like as it's been studied related to libraries in the past. So on the left is a dimension of social well-being, and in those colored boxes is data indicators Mike Norton, Mark Stern, and Elizabeth Young, and also Emily Dowdle in a previous publication have used to measure or create indexes for these left dimensions. So community health is measured by things like rates of mortality and morbidity, self-reported health status. Housing opportunity is measured using like the share of housing cost burden, or housing age or commute times. So that's when I'm talking about social well-being, I'm also thinking in this sort of broad definition of capabilities, but I'm also thinking in terms of specific dimensions and measurements. All of these definitions could be contested for like really valid reasons. They're what form the foundation of our working assumptions as we move through our research, but our project design allows for some hole poking and assumption disruption along the way. We always welcome critical appeals and questions, which you can drop in the chat as we go along our talk, or you can send them to me via email. We're working on these definitions. So this is where we are right now. In the future, we might be somewhere else. There are like gobs of people involved in this project, like so many people, that are working together to answer these questions. I only have the names on the slides of people that fit into these three categories, but there are many more people who have given their time and attention to our work and helped us formulate questions along the way. I was able to incorporate some of those on our resource sheet. There are probably many more. So we're good listeners, and so we pick up information from a lot of people. Our advisory board is Jerica Kopeny, Kwan McCann, who Meg mentioned earlier, who will be doing a workshop next month for Northern New York. Beth Patton and Bill Reed. Our research team is Ozzy Alozium, Blake Andrew, who's here with us, Meg Backus, and myself. If you want to know more about these people, I know I only have their names here, but I've linked to their places on the internet on our resource sheet. We also have 4 teams. So this project has 17 local research partners, and they work monthly with Ozzy and Blake in 4 teams to create community-based participatory research projects in Acoma Pueblo, Akwesasne Nation, Alaska, Georgia, Kansas, New York, and Texas. These folks dedicate hours every month to developing cross-community research, and they're going to implement it in the second half of this year. They also provide critical reviews of our replication of these social well-being indexes that Mike Norton and his team generated for the Understanding Social Wellbeing Impacts report. So we've replicated these at smaller scales, at the census tract and school district scales and zip code scales in some cases, other than 2 where we had to keep it at the county. So I just want you to know that there is some work here, and our research partners are like looking at those indexes, including library performance indexes, and thinking critically about them and giving them insights as to how we should change those. If any of the people here weren't a part of this project, it wouldn't be as good. We've been fortunate enough to have a lot of generous contributors of their brilliance and their ideas and their good thinking. With this project, we anticipate creating sort of 3 groups of products. We have these definitions that we're refining right now, and these definitions imply and shape how we're discussing values and value. We also have models, modeling, and fitness. So this sort of grouping is actual mathematical models that go into calculation and calculators. And it's also how we wish to model them. And it's also checking in with our research partners to make sure that as we model things for analysis, we're including the right things in our objectives and our constraints. In our project design, these are often referred to as phase 1, 2, and 3, but that erroneously implies that these are like implemented one at a time. These are actually just sort of buckets of work, and they iteratively feed each other, and they're happening concurrently. Today, what we'll focus on is definition, values, and value. Both a description of the product by the conclusion of the project next year, the end of next year. We'll have a functioning definition of libraries and their value that's been modeled, empirically estimated, and then simplified for calculations by library decision makers without the help of a consultant, or at least that's our goal. The work of defining is ongoing. So we spent the last year plus some months, year and 5 months, having conversations with librarians and library workers and their community invitees. And we use 3 major components: the radical imagination game, which is we use structured individual and group interviews, and data value and interpretation surveys. These first 2 elements are components in our pre-registered qualitative study, which is found on Open Science Framework. So it's another thing, I didn't link it on the resource sheet. So if anybody could help me remember to link those things from OSF on a resource sheet, I'd be mightily thankful. In the fall and winter of 2021, we invited a selection of 48 libraries from a maximum variation sample representing places in Alaska, Georgia, New York, and Texas to play the radical imagination game with OZ. You can learn more about the origins of this game in OZ's TED Talk, linked on the resource sheet. Participants used, in this game, OZ has stems and she has pillars, and these are randomly drawn to create discussion prompts like, what are your beliefs about access, and who do you talk to about belonging? I was a room lurker for all these conversations, and each was distinct and inspiring, and I would like leave the conversation being like, I can't believe I get to work with libraries, this is the best. Thanks, OZ, for doing it. So that was the radical imagination game, and it concluded in January of last year. We also did structured interviews and conversations. Contents of these conversations helped us refine a set of 4 questions that we used. So we had, what experiences have you had in libraries? What value do libraries bring to your community? What would a community library look and feel like? And how can public organizations, agencies, institutions promote community well-being? So these questions can be like super, super big. So the conversations would last somewhere between 20 and 60 minutes, sometimes a little longer, depending on the size of the group. The groups were on occasion individual interviews. Sometimes they were pairs from the same library, and sometimes they were larger groups where the library participant invited community partners or stakeholders into the conversation as well. And some of those folks that got invited were library non-users. So we were able to learn a lot of rich information about how people experience libraries and how individuals value libraries, even if they don't use libraries, which isn't a new finding. It comes up in work related to taxes and referendum votes that every library did, but and OCLC. But it's also super interesting to actually see in the room with folks willing to do a thing for their library, even if they don't use their library. Our findings were pretty consistent. Our findings from those 2 sets of conversations were pretty consistent with valuation literature, or literature about like library values or what they do for community or their role. And then we had a few surprises. Here are the things that we found jives with like other studies. The function of libraries is to promote connection, curiosity, creativity, discovery, expanded learning or thinking, learning, growth, and improvement. Some that fit with value evaluation literature and meta-analysis, and other qualitative studies, our libraries are valued as an informational tool for discovery and learning, but also as a hands-on space for making. Libraries are valued for access to technology in addition to their books and education roles. And what libraries can do to support community well-being, we heard that libraries serve as information infrastructure to support health and other crisis imperative information needs. This is like a super close tie into Beth Patton's work in disaster response. Libraries preserve and promote local heritage, local cultural heritage. This fits a lot of the work I see. And again, Beth Patton's work in epistemicide, and where libraries both fall short and where they are doing the right thing. Libraries are a hub for services and social connection. And again, this sort of feeds all of the tendrils of social connection literature that we see about libraries and why libraries are valuable to communities. There are also some surprises. As library workers, we hadn't taken the time to consider the formative role libraries have for developing independence and a sense of self among children and adolescents. I feel like just this one finding and its policy implication could just be like someone's lifelong research agenda. That's, in my opinion, it's not going to be mine, but I think it should be someone's. Almost like nearly everyone we interviewed last winter described their very first experience of independence as being like that the library was the first place they were allowed to walk or ride their bike to independently, or it was the first place they were allowed to wander off away from their parents, or choose or make a selection independently of an adult. Like it's just a really rich place. As researchers, we may have underestimated, or maybe like more accurately, I think that participants in the radical imagination game were coming from a really inspiring place. Like it's a game that is structured to inspire us to talk about where we want to be and how we'd like to imagine a better future for ourselves and our communities. And so when we got to the structured interview part of our qualitative study, we maybe didn't entirely, we weren't entirely ready for the scope of anxiety in this socio-political moment. Like tensions about what is and what is not a library or a librarian's role within a community setting isn't new. These are like long-held professional debates. What was new is that in a room full of people who all agree on that, there was real fear, like real and consequential to service, fears of backlash. Some perceived flashpoints were like whether a service that supported a transient population, including tourists, was reducing service to community members, or how to have a health information programming in the library without being seen as being like an arm of government overreach or paternalism. And then these everyday anxieties around service and what is right, and whether there will be backlash in community perception, were compounded by the current pervasive fear of harassment and disciplinary action, or even arrest of library workers that they're contending with. We had nothing to do with the urban library trauma study, but I wanted to call your attention to it. It's a completely separate thing and it doesn't have anything to do with our findings, but it's so rich and has so much information. I think that libraries of any size and library decision makers should read it. It's linked on the sheet. So all of these findings and surprises intensified our interest in understanding how power and decision-making contexts influence definitions and perceptions. So in addition to questions about whether or not specific data indicators belong in a library performance index, for instance, or a social well-being index that we replicated, we wanted to ask about specific conditions in the library related to decision flow and ownership among volunteers. So in our surveys that we've sent to our local research partners, we asked, like, does the index have the right data? Are we interpreting these data in the right way? But also, how does power work? Now that I've told you that we heard from folks and how we interpreted it, I'd like to take a minute to talk through why in a study of well-being, we're interested in decision-making power and agency. Our measurement of interest is social well-being, which is built on theories of capability developed by economist Amartya Sen, who's shown here, and extended by political philosopher Martha Nussbaum, as well as others. Sen's description of capability as the development ideal wherein people have the freedom to lead lives they have reason to value is the basis of our interest. Freedom can't actually be realized without control or agency, which is likely why we see elements of self-determination or mutual aid or reciprocity and agency or power across indexes in economics, health, and disaster resilience. And we've got some of the indexes that we use linked on the resource sheet. Key across descriptions and measures of well-functioning socio-ecological systems is how widely meaningful power is shared. When I say meaningful power, I mean the effective power to act in a way that is welfare maximizing. This is the crux of capability. So why, when we talk about libraries, we say libraries might facilitate meaningful and effective power sharing, they also might block such efforts for local, cultural, historical, and personal reasons. I invite you to consider for a moment your own community and library and how power is either consolidated via gatekeepers or other local rules and norms, or shared via local rules and norms. To summarize the qualitative work we've done till now, we have a working definition for libraries. We have a good idea about values that are present in library practice. We're on track to know internal and external perceptions of how libraries contribute to community well-being. So now it's time to talk about money. We also know that we pay library workers and buildings and for books with money. So we'd like some monetary units to assign value to libraries. We still have another 18 months in this project. So we're talking about money now, so then we can sort of go back and forth between values, valuation, and forms of value when calculating or creating tools for library decision makers. There's a lot of discomfort and valid concern about placing a price tag on a priceless community service. So show of hands. I'm going to see if I can actually see a show of hands if I try. Show of hands, how many of you have used an ROI figure on a report to a legislator or your board or a community group? Yeah. Show of hands, how many of your libraries have this is how much money you saved in your visit to the library today on the checkout receipts? Yep. Okay, so you're all putting a price tag on library service. Cool, done. So let's just like set the resistance to that idea aside. Many of us do it for a practical reason. The difference is that the way we do it is based on commercial markets of value. So for me, the big downside of our discomfort with assigning money value to library service is that we've allowed commercial markets and like late 20th century business norms to decide how we quantify library value. And it's typically measured like this. We assign a dollar value to a specific resource, be it a program or a physical material. We multiply it by the times it is used, and that's the value. It's essentially called a market analog approach. There are alternatives to market values that other fields use, like health and stratification and environmental economists, all handle priceless values in different ways. In part because there are other ways of valuing something. When we use a market analog, the kind of valuation that we've been using, we're only capturing this transactional or use value. But people have non-use values like existence value. A town should have a library. A future value, it would be okay to lose the internet for a week because the library has the internet. Or bequest value, like my grandchildren should have a library to visit in this town where they live. By eliciting willingness to pay from individuals, which is what's called a stated preference, and it's collected using surveys, we can actually estimate a person's value for a thing regardless of how often they use it. Although some people who use a service every single day will value it higher, some people simply won't. There's a practice, like a subset of practice within stated preference called contingent valuation, where we ask people to value a small change in the level of service that they receive. And recent studies of like valid survey instruments show that setting this up as a ballot proposition with a coercive tax is the most accurate way to find out how much a person would actually be willing to pay for a service or a new service. In fields where stated preference is common, they follow a set of standards for reporting results, and a researcher could use a meta-analysis across studies to get a generalizable median estimate of service for an organization. And then we could do like benefit transfer and apply these findings to communities where there have been no studies. There's like all this neat stuff. We can't do any of that with libraries because we have no such standard of practice for reporting our data, and we have no national valuation research agenda at this point. So I have like a little write-up on why this does and doesn't work based on a meta-analysis I did. But just know I tried. It didn't work out. Let's try something else. We people in the libraries and community systems research team are mostly undeterred by obstacles like this. Huzzah! We know, I just told you that like the best survey instruments are where we pretend to have a ballot. In the United States, a lot of public libraries have the freedom to go for a public vote annually to their communities. These tax referendums are a huge wellspring of data where individuals are annually asked to reveal their preference and value for a public library, which is pretty cool. We want to do a couple things with these data. We want to estimate median willingness to pay, a dollar value for library service in the US. And we want to estimate marginal value for increase in a few core library services like square footage, hours open, programming. In order to make it happen, we need to know some stuff about each vote. So we need to know what library is being voted on, if it is an operational or a building related vote, how many people, not the percent of people, voted yes, how many people voted no, and the amount of money they were voting on. With the help of John Kratzka, I'm trying to remember like what comes next. Oh, yeah. With the help of John Kratzka from Every Library, he shared with us 2013 through 2019 through 2021 data. And he also helped us with Library Journal's list of referendums that had occurred. But the Library Journal data doesn't tell us vote counts or dollar amounts. Michigan and Ohio both collect all the votes that happen in their states annually and make that publicly available from 2010 through 2022. So high five, Rust Belt. We're currently, like Blake and I are currently working on pairing the 1,100 votes that we have that are mostly from Michigan and Ohio to library and community information and filling the gaps in the counts with dollar amounts from our every library data that we got. It will never be complete enough to do a true national estimate because there are library types. So these different colored dots are different kinds of governance. So different setups or styles of libraries in the US. And so you can see that this is like really regionally clustered. And some of these governance or administrative setups allow for a public vote, and some of them don't. They just don't. Some states allow for public votes, some don't. I'll make a soft pitch here in case there are state library people in states where there aren't public library votes to consider conducting referendum style surveys community by community, but I can totally get why that would be super onerous. When we have more information and we can gather it all up, we'll use a regression setup to make a monetary value calculator based on marginal or single increment increases or decreases in service, and apply a dollar figure to those increments and decrements. So you might want to help us with this. I don't know. You may be willing, may be interested. I've focused on our work establishing measures of library value, but we're also asking people about their organizations, as I mentioned, and how they fit into community networks and their opinions and how we should view and measure individual dimensions of well-being. There are ways anyone watching the later video or in this workshop right now could, if they wanted, help us out. So the first way is with votes. Did your library have a public funding vote between the years 2010 and 2022? Consider sharing your vote details with us using this survey link, also on the sheet, don't worry. It will ask for your library information like IMLS identifier if you have it, the name, county, state, number of yes votes, number of no votes, and any information from the ballot that you can include, like, is it a building or operational? How much money? Is it a millage or is it a dollar amount? That's really state dependent. And who collects the taxes? Is it your school district? Is it your county? Is it your city? If you would like a report on your library and community based on our draft replication of the Understanding Social Wellbeing's report indexes of library performance and social wellbeing indexes, I'll send you one. I've made the data for every library in the US, and making a custom report for your library, now that we've worked out the kinks, would take around 1 to 2 hours. In return, though, I would ask that you fill out 3 surveys: a library performance index report survey, a pre-reading social wellbeing opinion survey, and a social wellbeing index report survey. Your responses would help us make choices about how generalizable the guidance that we receive from our 17 research partners is. Further, it would help us figure out like aspects of indexes that are just universally not loved. If you want to help on the survey part, send us your info using this link. I'll start sending those reports out to anybody who signs up for them toward the end of February. Okay, so I know that this project is really big. I hope I've given you like a sense of what we've learned so far. We'll probably do another webinar late summer, so toward the end of July, based on this referendum study and our initial monetary and marginal, marginal value calculator that we've produced by then. If we get enough voting information for places outside of Ohio and Michigan, we'll really have something quite useful. If we don't, then we can just make some like general statements, but we won't be able to create a calculator out of it. As ever, if you have any comments or questions, just let me know.